Welcome to Reinventing Parking, the podcast about parking policy for anyone who wants a better city and better urban transport. I'm your host, Paul Barter, and this time I've got a guest, Dr. Elizabeth Taylor, or Liz Taylor, who is Senior Lecturer in Urban Planning and Design at Monash University in Melbourne. And over the last 10 years or so, she's done a lot of research on parking, although she's having a bit of a rest from parking at the moment, a well-deserved rest. Liz and I had a long discussion, and I plan to use parts of it in several other episodes on various topics. But in this one, we'll focus mainly on the collision between parking reform and anti-development sentiment in residential areas. Liz has some important and entertaining insights and observations to share. And if they pique your interest, the reinventingparking.org article for this episode will have links to her papers. Now, let's get into it. Welcome to the podcast, Liz.
Hi, Paul. Thank you for having me. And thank you for your ongoing enthusiasm around parking.
Yes, occasionally the enthusiasm is stretched when I feel depressed about the progress, but there's been a lot of progress on parking reform this year, so we're all feeling fairly good in the parking reform network and the parking reform movement. You have a talent for entertaining names for your paper, and the paper that got you interested was Fight the Towers or Kiss Your Car Park Goodbye, which I gather was a quote from a flyer in Melbourne.
Yes, fabulously. I mean, in some ways, I just admire the sloganeering around parking, but that specific poster, and I think that's getting on to 10, not quite 10 years ago, but certainly 8 or so. I was at the time studying more the political dynamics around change and density increases in Melbourne. So a lot of the inner parts of Melbourne have, had increasing construction of apartments. Of course, the neighbours don't always like it, but in this case, the neighbours in Toorak, which is a well-heeled suburb of Melbourne, had put together a poster to mobilise community opposition to the construction of towers, which I think is important to note were literally next to the train station. Yeah, to fight the towers or kiss your car park goodbye. And that equivalence, which I still see now, that any increase in housing is an increase in TARs, and specifically that increase in TARs is a direct threat to your own car's occupation of public street space, is definitely the way I found my way into this. And that's been incredibly contested for years around change and anxiety about people arriving and population increases. So there's definitely that. But it's also the fact that population increases have meant basically increases in cars. Like the growth in car ownership and car use in Melbourne has far outstripped growth in dwellings or population. So people do have that experience of cars in Melbourne, and you can't actually submit a planning objection to people buying a car, but you can object to apartments going up next door, and that's the sort of equivalence that people feel. And there's also, I think, a desperate belief that if you can just stop the apartments being built, that you'll be able to park your car at the front wherever you go. They have a bit of a cynical attitude to it, because it's the cycle of it. I found it really frustrating. In that original paper, Fight the Towers or Kiss Your Car Parking Goodbye, I ended up thinking about it in terms of rights. That was actually, I think, through one of the reviewer comments. So whoever they were, thank you. But thinking about the assertion of rights and rights to space and the ways cars figure into that. But that's been a theme that you've explored in various contexts, hasn't it? And it's a very interesting way of looking at it, because it's bizarre, isn't it? Machines, cars having rights somehow. Yeah, but deeply politicised rights, like a right to the city. And where it gets, I think, challenging for me, and also I think interesting, challenging, not in that kind of sarcastic way that I'm talking about everything else, is that for many people, they do experience the world through a car, and that's often, you're talking about diversity of experiences, people with a disability, women who are afraid of violence or who have experienced violence. Even I've been thinking lately about people who have experienced homelessness. In a context in which housing is extraordinarily expensive, a car is often a closer version of the house that people have. So there is something genuine about the car's right to the city being a person's right to the city. But then I also just want to wheel it back and say, no, they're a car. And not only are they an object, they're a lot larger than a person. So actually accommodating them is really difficult. And then that consequence part that I've landed on with that initial paper was the consequence of this assertion of rights and the right to park on the street. It impacts other people's rights in the sense that those that are buying the apartments or renting the apartments, they have to have this parking that they don't even use. And ironically, the parking system, the planning system, which is supposed to be considering all this kind of environmental, economic considerations in terms of land use and change, it spends most of its time thinking about parking and is under pressure to just have more parking. So it is, there's a consequence to that.
Yes, and a huge amount of human resources in the planning system devoted to something that could be dealt with so much more easily. And some of those equity issues, in fact, all of those equity issues can and should be addressed. And it's certainly true that there will be car-dependent individuals in need, and we need to find a way to accommodate their needs. But giving everybody free parking in the name of helping those particular people doesn't seem efficient.
These things really genuinely matter, as you say. Planners should care. Anyone with an interest in public space, all these things should care about whether someone can afford to access space, someone feels safe in space, etc. But parking is not the thing that's going to solve that. And there's something also deeply suspicious about the fact that suddenly everyone cares about whether or not a nurse can afford to get to work because it's something to do with free parking. They didn't care about it when it came to affordable housing or even better public transport or better pay. Say any of these things along the line that led to this woman having to pay for parking all mattered. And now we can't solve it just by making it parking free. So you're probably spending, this imaginary person, 2/3 of her income on the car.
Exactly. And I think you said in that same paper, I think you had a nice paragraph where you had a juxtaposition between the what if fears around small shortages of parking and the fact that it might then need to be managed, and that's being seen as a disaster, versus the what if scenarios around all sorts of far more important planning issues that the planning system says are its top priorities, like climate and local drainage and all sorts of other very important things. Housing.
Yes, housing, trees, and all sorts of things and considerations of life and urban space. Parking is that kind of trump card. And that's why I've continued to study it, but also have moments of being like, I don't know.
A lot of the anxiety around abolishing minimums, you get the impression that many people are a bit confused, and in their minds they're thinking maximums, and there will not be enough parking fears. Those would be reasonable if we were talking about maximums.
Yes, there's confusion, and that's how I got interested in it. Was when you do a development, you have to put up advertising, and the advertising will say, it won't say how many parking spaces you have. It'll say whether you're looking to reduce it from the mandated number. And most people seem to interpret that in two kind of key areas of anxiety. One is that it sounds to them as though someone's literally coming along and taking away car parking spaces rather than a reduction in the minimum additional number of car parks that you're going to put in. And secondly, they just think about the on-street parking. And that's a continuous point of frustration for me, is that it's so hard to, outside of the world of parking reform nerds, to think about off-street parking and on-street parking in the same conversation. People parking on the street clearly are doing it all the time because everyone's worrying about it. They're worried that if a new development doesn't have enough off-street parking, that someone's going to park on the street and they won't be able to park on the street. So they make them have more. It just, there's something, I think it's driven me crazy. It's like, do you really think that adding 100 car parks in that apartment building is going to mean you can park on the street? So there's definitely a communication difference, and there's a kind of, obviously a lot of anxiety, and that's how I've followed my research into parking. And there's something procedurally, the burden on the premise
of proof.
Yeah, that you have to start with the minimums, and any alternatives have to defend themselves. So that's the kind of situation we're in outside of the CBD. Not to say that the CBD has solved all their problems, but they certainly have some of the best ideas around it in terms of street parking and metering and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So we started off talking about residential developments and the opposition to those using parking as an excuse, perhaps. There's an element of excuse around parking and an element of real fears about where will I park. It's hard to say exactly which balance of the two.
I've tried to find out, but it's just me.
But you did some research to kind of investigate who really was parking and why were there problems in certain areas with parking.
In a residential one, yeah. I found that was called, I think it originally had a punny title, and then by the time it got into the journal, they changed it to a normal title.
Who's been parking on my street?
That is a punny title, yeah.
Yes.
I think it's later published as just Politics of Residential Parking. And that was meant to be a reference to, I don't know, Three Bears or something. But the motivation for that was coming out of my initial interest in parking being around densification on new housing construction in Melbourne. A lot of the planning system's attention, certainly a lot of the public engagement around change and opposition to change is around parking, and specifically the fear that if you build apartments, people will so many P's. If you build apartments, people will park on the street, and that will mean that other people, can't park on the street anymore. And therefore, either I think the preferred version is no apartments or no new houses. But if we do build new apartments, they have to meet the minimum requirements and preferably exceed them. The more parking, the better. That was the kind of situation. But then I was thinking, and amongst all this, it's not ever actually been established, first of all, who is parking on the street in residential areas in these Australian cities where it's such a increasingly contested, because they not only cars, other kinds of claims to the space and just more and more cars. So increasingly contested space of the street in residential areas. Who is actually parking on it? Is it people in apartments? And is it because they don't have enough parking, required or provided? So there wasn't any evidence about there at all. So I wanted to try and understand that. I made use of two kind of imperfect sources, but it was sort of getting some way towards it. One is this ongoing travel survey they have in Victoria called VISTA, the Victorian Integrated Survey of Travel Activity. It's like a travel diary system. And that had some data in there around how people travelled, where they parked and how they paid for it at the end of the journey. And I also put out my own online survey for people to, so voluntary, which comes with its own limitations, but where I asked about how much parking do you have and where do you park at home, essentially. And my initial suspicion was actually that the reason people would park on the street in a residential area was they just had too many cars. That's where I was sort of coming from. But it sort of ended up slightly surprising, but it's been a useful insight for me. So first of all, from the VISTA survey and from my own survey, definitely found that the most common users of street parking in Australian cities are people in detached houses and to the less extent terrace houses, townhouses. So attached is the terminology. So not apartments. The apartments are the minority of housing anyway, but they use even less of the street parking than the proportion of housing stock they make up. So it's mostly people in lower density housing using street parking by a fairly large margin, actually. And then secondly, that are something around a third or 40% of people in apartments have parking spaces that they don't use at all, can't use it for anything, which is quite confronting in some ways. But then as to why people that park on the street at home are, fighting it out constantly for street parking, I found that most of them, not all of them, but the majority of them had parking, specifically garage parking, and that they were using their garage to store their stuff. So that tied into a few interesting papers since that, which have been great to see.
In various places, Los Angeles and other places.
Los Angeles.
Similar findings, yeah.
I think one from somewhere else in California recently, and certainly one from Germany as well, that where it's not a sort of necessarily a supply question for parking. It's how you choose to park, and that word rights again. So in this Australian context, they have a garage, but they just fill it with all their stuff, and then they park on the street because they can. But then that next step is what gets me. Then you're going to make someone else have a car park that doesn't even
which
want
they
it.
Won't need, yeah.
And in fact, that they can't use because there's a kind of legal difference around apartment, basement or sort of multi-level parking in we call strata here, or owners corporation, where you have the car park it's not physically on your property, it's, in the basement of the apartment building. That's controlled by another level of governance called an owners corporation or strata, and they usually restrict your use of that space. So I had people in my survey talking about how they live in an apartment, they have a car parking space, they don't have a car, they can't use it for anything else because of the owners corporation rules.
They can't rent it to anyone else.
Yeah, and that seems to be very difficult. And when I'm feeling more motivated, that's an area I think of parking reform or change in Australia, I think has a lot of possibility, and I think would be an easier fix, is that it is extraordinarily hard to make better use of. We've built a lot of residential parking in particular that isn't actually used very much, and it could be sort of brought into broader circulation and bring some of that pressure off the street parking. But it's quite difficult to do that. So it shouldn't be, but it is in practice because of the owners corporation rules around security and things like that. So yeah, that was that residential one. And now, of course, whenever I'm walking around suburbs, I'm always, if someone's got their garage open, I always sort of sneak a look in. It's like, could they fit their car in there? Or what else is in there? It's like prams and dog boxes and, Christmas trees and things like that. So that's another piece of research I'd like to do as well, would be like literally just combing through people's garages. And
Yes. So, okay, just to read another one of your papers, The Elephant in the Planning Scheme. And this was how cities still work around the dominance of parking space. So
that was a historical one, yeah.
That's the historical one, okay.
Yes.
Looking at the long history since the 1920s in Melbourne of how parking has been managed. Okay.
I mean, in Donald Shoup and others, parking worked. I think you inevitably have to look at historically, because if you sort of just zoomed in from outer space now, you wouldn't go, you know what we need to do? Build a lot of parking. So to understand why things are done the way they are, I think you have to look back. And it is part of this history of automobility and how cities are planned around, reshaped by. In this case, I looked specifically at Melbourne. How have planners thought about parking? What was their attitude to, solving parking problems? And how is this actually reflected in legislation as well? And I was mainly interested in just tracing the history, where did this come from? But the main points of interest I got from it was that, first of all, the very first metropolitan plan, this is a nascent planning profession in the 1920s. There was a plan prepared for Melbourne in 1929 that was never implemented, but it was a very comprehensive set of ideas and surveys. And at that point, it's a kind of classic arc of motorization where the city is starting to be like swamped by cars, and there's cars everywhere. And that document's really interesting because it talks about cars and car parking sort of the same way Parking Reform Network would now. It's like they're everywhere and they just take up space. And planners at that point in Melbourne were very much putting forward an idea that actually these new cars that are everywhere, they shouldn't have such an unmitigated claim to public space, and we need to do something about it. But that never came to pass. And by the time town planning legislation was actually really given teeth and the strategy was implemented, it was in the post-Second World War period, is when motorisation had really escalated. Car ownership was much more rapidly taken up. And the planning scheme at that point, very unapologetically proposing how can we make Melbourne a place that's easier for parking, and marrying up, in a way, the strategy, which was to make the city more amenable for parking, matched up with the minimums, which they copy. I think there's one last thing, is that they very directly got the parking minimums from Los Angeles. They had Charles Bennett, who's the head of planning from Los Angeles, was invited out to talk about how planning and zoning worked and parking, and that parking minimums were adopted Melbourne-wide on the strength of that Los Angeles connection.
Well, thanks again, Liz.
On that note, thank you, Paul.
On that note, you've been listening to the Reinventing Parking podcast, and I'm Paul Barter. You can find out more at reinventingparking.org, where you'll find ideas and tips on parking policy. You can also listen to other episodes, subscribe, or leave a comment. That's reinventingparking.org. Bye for now.